Greetings in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, our coming King. Today, we're in the 7th of our Daniel series. This time we're taking a second look at Daniel 8 and looking how it has been twisted. Twisted specifically by the Seventh-day Adventist Church and their prophet Ellen G. White. We'll dig into that in a moment, but let's do a little bit of review as to where we are in Daniel 8. Daniel 8, by the way, is the only prophecy of the 4 chapters we're looking at, 2, 7, 8, and 9, the only one that's completely fulfilled before Jesus comes. 2, 7, and 9 all carry into the gospel age. But Daniel 8 is totally about the Jews and the temple and time before Jesus. If you remember, it was a time of strong Hellenization by the government of Syria, trying to push everybody away from anything that was not Hellenistic, which means materialistic. There were good things about Hellenization, especially the Greek language. The fact that the Greek language was spread abroad is important as far as the spread of the gospel is concerned. The New Testament, is all written in Greek, and so many people spoke Greek that was helpful to the spread of the gospel. But other aspects of the Hellenization were quite materialistic, and in particular, out of Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes and others besides him were very much against the Jewish religion, very much against the worship in the temple, very much against their keeping the Sabbath day, their circumcising their children, contrary to all of that. And so Antiochus Epiphanes attacked it all. He attacked the high priesthood, he attacked the temple itself, stealing the vessels, the veil, various things out of the temple. And he finally put a statue of Zeus in there, I believe it was Zeus, and offered a pig as a sacrifice. If you can think of that, that's so horrible. The pig was an unclean animal, and to sacrifice a pig to completely desecrate it. Because of his efforts, quite a while before actually the sacrifices were completely stopped in the temple, they were more or less not being taken care of. He fought against the high priesthood. As a matter of fact, a Benjaminite was put in the priesthood. It was supposed to be the Levites only. They paid money to get into the priesthood and all kinds of things against the worship of God, against the truth of God. And the sad thing is that there were many Jews who were taken away with all of this. They were for the secularization too. It reminds us of what's going on in the United States, in the West in general, in the world today, as secular efforts are increasing more and more against God, against Christ, against the gospel. And there are those who call themselves Christians who cave into it and go along with it. There are others who oppose. In some parts of the world, there's death penalty by those who are persecuting Christians. We haven't reached that yet here, but they were suffering death penalty under Antiochus Epiphanes if they would circumcise their children, if they would keep the Sabbath or whatever. It was a total effort to blot out the religion of God in Jerusalem among the Jews. Now, you'll remember that Antiochus Epiphanes is called a little horn, and you'll remember that we have a little horn in both chapter 7 and chapter 8. And it's a shame, but there are many people who confuse the two little horns. That is, they think a little horn is a little horn, and so it's the same individual in chapter 7 and in chapter 8. And in particular, that's what the Seventh-day Adventists do. And there are many others who confuse the two. But they're both little horns, yes. And they're both enemies of God's people. But let's get the setting. The setting in chapter 7 is the Roman Empire. The animal, the beast, is the Roman Empire. In the chapter 8, it's a goat, which represents Greece. And so in 7, it's the Roman Empire. In 8, it's the Greece. Of course, the historical order is reverse of that. In chapter 7, there are 10 horns, and then a little horn comes up and replaces 3 of them. In chapter 8, the little horn grows out of one of the 4 horns. We've seen that in chapter 8, the little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he fights against God's people, the Jews, at that time. In chapter 7, the little horn is the papacy, and he fights against the Christians, who are God's people at that time. There is a time period in both of them, but they are very different time periods. In chapter 7, the little horn of Rome, there's the time period of 1260 years. And we mentioned we weren't going to go into specific details about that. The 1260 years, mentioned various ways, 3.5 times, 42 months, and so forth, is mentioned more times in the book of Revelation than it is in the book of Daniel. So it kind of more naturally fits into a study of the book of Revelation. But it's a different time that is mentioned in Daniel 8. It's 2,300 years. 2,300 years. And that time period is the specific thing that is wrenched out of chapter 8 by the Seventh-day Adventists, beginning more or less with Ellen White and others with her at her time. And well, we'll see what that goes to. But first of all, let's talk about the underlying problem of this. Because it all has to do with people predicting when Jesus is going to come. When's Jesus going to come? Well, let's predict when it's going to be. And throughout the ages, people have taken different information out of the Bible, time periods and events and so forth, and have attempted to predict when Jesus is going to come. You know that Jesus said that nobody knows, but let's read it in Matthew 24, 35 and 36. It says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words, Jesus said, will not pass away. But no one knows of that day and hour, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only. Nobody knows the time. Not even Jesus at that time knew it. There is the parable of the 10 virgins, and the message at the end of the parable of the 10 virgins, you remember that 5 were prepared and 5 were not prepared. And Jesus says, watch therefore, for you don't know the day or the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. Don't know. But so many people are not satisfied. I think in almost every age, people have said, Jesus is coming. He's going to be here. He's going to be here. Well, we do need to be ready. We don't know when it's going to be. And it's true that we do need to be ready. But to say dogmatically it's going to happen in our lifetime, it's going to happen in the next few years, or to put a specific date upon it, there are 3 date setters that come to my mind. The most recent one is in 2011. Some of you might remember, you might not. I don't know. It didn't make as big a splash as a lot of other things. But Harold Camping, a preacher of Family Radio, I believe he founded Family Radio and was the president of Family Radio. He predicted that Jesus was going to come on May the 21st in 2011. I don't know what all statistics he attempted to use to come up with that, but he came up with that and he preached it and believed it. And of course, May 21st of 2011 came and went. It's over 10 years ago. Jesus didn't come. Of course, he was disappointed, and people who believed him were disappointed. As far as I know, no new church was established because of that. But if we go back further, you may recognize the year 1914, connecting that with the so-called Jehovah's Witnesses. They still call that an important date today. But what many people do not know is that Charles Russell, back in the late 1800s, wrote books and predicted the end of the Gentile time, the end of the world in 1914. It was a group of people called Bible students, and they used various calculations to come up with 1914. Well, in particular, he used the account of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar he was going to be like an animal, eating grass and all of that, and told him that 7 times would pass over him. Well, 7 times, most people take that to mean 7 years. But Charles Russell said, we got to take a day for a year. And so if you take all the days in 7 years, you've got 2,520 days, and we make that in years. I don't know how he decided when it was supposed to start, but he picked the date as to when it was supposed to start, and it ended in 1914. And so the end of the world is in 1914. Jesus is going to come. Well, 1914 is over 100 years ago. Jesus obviously didn't come, obviously. Well, not to those Bible students. At that time, they were not called Jehovah's Witnesses. That name came later. And many of the followers, of course, left, but there were those who held on to the date. And well, Jesus came spiritually, or the kingdom began in heaven, or whatever their particular explanation is. And so they held on to 1914 as a very important date. But let's get to William Miller. William Miller, back before that, was a man who studied the Bible considerably, and he got involved in dates. And he found the 2,300 days, mornings and evenings, it's called, it depends on your translation. And it says that the sanctuary is going to be cleansed. His idea is that the cleansing of the sanctuary, they believed that the sanctuary was the earth. I don't know how they got that, and that the cleansing of it was the fire that's going to happen when Jesus returns. And so he put that together and got a starting date, which we'll talk about. And the ending date was around 1843 or 44. And gradually there were more and more people of different denominations who followed his idea and went along with it. And they were expecting Jesus. He didn't come. And then a fellow by the name of Snow in the movement did some particular calculations. And he came up with a specific day. In October 22nd, 1844, Jesus is going to come. And I mean, that idea really took off among many denominations. People really believed it. As the time came near, they neglected their farms, they neglected personal things in the house. They neglected all kinds of things. They were being very spiritual. They were examining their hearts. They were expecting Jesus. The life on earth was done, and he's going to come, and he didn't. And they actually call it in history the Great Disappointment. Of course, it was a disappointment. I mean, the people really believed it. So many people, so many here in this country, the U.S., believed it, and it didn't happen. And of course, a good share of those people walked away, not only from that belief, but away from their church, away from Christianity of any kind altogether, because it didn't happen what they were expecting. But in cases like this, there are always some people who hang on. Ellen G. White was one of those. And she and other people came up with a different explanation. They were so emotionally taken up. And you know that many people follow religion according to emotions, not according to truth. And they were so emotionally taken up that they said, well, the date's got to be right. But what we thought was going to happen is different. And so they manufactured the idea that Jesus, instead of coming to earth, he went to a different compartment in heaven and cleansed it. And that's the cleansing that is predicted in Daniel 8. Sad, sad, sad. And so Daniel 8 is taken by the Seventh-day Adventists as ignoring all about Antiochus Epiphanes and the temple, and the Jews, and the cleansing of the temple, and all of that, ignoring all of that, and ripping it away from all of that, and making it something that it is not at all. Now, you remember that the ram in chapter 8 is Persia, and the goat is Greece. Seventh-day Adventists agree with that. They agree that the first king was Alexander. They agree that the empire was broken up into 4 parts. They're in agreement with that. I mean, that's the history shows that, and they're in agreement with that. But then let's take a look of what happens after that. Let's look at what it really says and what they say about it. We're going to be reading in Daniel 8, and first of all, we'll read from 8 to 12 with a few remarks. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly, that's Greece. When he was strong, the great horn, Alexander the Great, was broken, and instead there came up 4 notable horns, the 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire, and we all agree on that. They came up 4 notable horns toward the 4 winds of the sky, or heaven, and out of them, that's where the disagreement begins. Out of them. Out of what? Out of the horns or out of the winds? Well, it's kind of absurd to say that it came, they go through some things to try to make it mean the winds, but do winds produce horns? I mean, that's rather absurd. Why are you even talking about the Grecian Empire if the little horn doesn't come out of the Grecian Empire? It comes out of the horns. They say it comes out of 4 winds, disconnected to the horns. And they make it to be Rome. Papal Rome and pagan Rome first, and then Papal Rome, instead of it being Antiochus Epiphanes. The text says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land, and it grew great even to the army of the sky, or the host of heaven, depending upon your version. And it cast down some of the army and of the stars to the ground and trampled them. Well, in the context, this army or host and the stars would be important Jewish people. According to the Seventh-day Adventists, well, that's talking about Christians and actually talking about heaven when we get to verse 11. Yes, it magnified itself even to the prince of the army. They say the prince of the army is Jesus. So here's the papacy that's magnifying himself up against Jesus. Even to the prince of the army, and it took away, listen to this now, it took away from him, from the prince of the army, and in the context here where it took away from him the continual burnt offering, that would be the high priest. And the offerings where? And the place of the sanctuary was cast down. That's vital to understanding this, where it talks about the continual burnt offering and the sanctuary. In the context, that would be some Greek influence person who would come against the temple of God in Jerusalem. But they make it against heaven, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Verse 12, the army was given over to it, together with a continual burnt offering through disobedience. It cast down truth to the ground, and it did its pleasure and prospered. All right, now, verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who spoke, how long will the vision about the continual burnt offering and the disobedience that makes desolate to give both the sanctuary and the army or the host to be trodden underfoot? That's the question. All right. We can't understand verse 14 unless we're clear on the question. The prophecy is talking about the continual burnt offering being taken away. It's talking about the sanctuary being trodden underfoot. How long is that bad situation going to be? Verse 14 says, he said to 2,300 days. Seventh-day Adventists make it years. And they say that a day has to be a year. In prophecy, a day is a year. Well, sometimes, but not always. It's only sometimes that it's that way. It doesn't work here because that many years, the temple is long gone. Jumping down to verses 21 to 23, it says, the rough male goat is the king of Greece. Okay, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great. As for that which was broken in the place wherein four stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of that nation, but not with his power. In the latter time of their kingdom, the latter time of the split Grecian kingdom, when the transgressors have come to the full, a king of fierce face and understanding dark sentences will stand up. That's the little horn. And obviously it says in the latter part of the Grecian Empire, and that doesn't fit with the Seventh-day Adventist explanation. Now, let's unpack this a little bit. It's very confusing, and they don't connect the dots. It's really a mess when they explain this part of the prophecy and that part of the prophecy and another part of the prophecy, but they don't connect them together, and it's a shame. When does the 2300 begin? They say it ends in 1844. When does it begin? Obviously, as we've read in the text already, it begins with the desecration of the temple, with the trotting down of the temple, with the causing the sacrifices of the temple to cease. That's when it begins. Somebody, I don't know, can't find out who's the original person, if it was Ellen G. White or if somebody else came up with the idea that, well, chapter 8 doesn't tell us when it begins. So we go to chapter 9. And they do some gymnastics with a term or so and try to make it teach that the prophecy in Daniel 8 begins at the same time as the prophecy in Daniel 9. They do good work, in terms of when it begins in Daniel 9. Daniel 9 is the 70-week prophecy, and it begins with an order to establish again, rebuild Jerusalem. There are various orders, but the order that really fits is 457, which takes us to the time of Christ. They are absolutely correct in Daniel 9 with picking 457 as the beginning point. But the idea that that's the beginning point of chapter 8 makes no sense. You read chapter 8, what's the beginning point? It has to do with the casting down of the temple, the stopping of the sacrifices. It's a very different starting point. The starting point is against the temple. The starting point in chapter 9 is for the temple, for Jerusalem in general. It's a matter of reestablishing, rebuilding Jerusalem. It's a positive time. But the beginning date in Daniel 8 is a very sad time against the temple, the work of God. So their counting of the 2300 years, they say, begins in 457, the same time as the 70 weeks begins in chapter 9. Next time we'll be talking about chapter 9. That's a different story. But what they failed, they explain different things and go into all kinds of details and arguments for different things. But one thing I have not been able to find is them connecting 457 with anything in Daniel 8. Daniel 8's talking about the Grecian Empire. That's well after 457 BC. They say that it has to do with Rome. Well, in 457 BC, Rome only controlled a little bit of Italy. The Roman Empire wasn't there at all. To make it to be Rome, not only pagan Rome, but also papal Rome, is completely disconnected from 457. Where's the ceasing of the continual offerings? They offer nothing. They don't discuss it. How the offerings were not taken care of. They don't discuss how the sanctuary was cast down in 457. It's the opposite. In 457, it's on the way of being built up. There's nothing that connects with 457. So you don't have a beginning of the 2300 days, which they make to be years. If you don't have the beginning, you don't have the ending. One of the most common things, they do teach different things from what I've been able to find out. They do teach different things about what is the taking away of the daily. And don't expect me to explain it all, because it's not explained well at all by them. But they connect it with the Roman Catholic Mass. Now, the Roman Catholic Mass comes about somewhere maybe around 500 AD. So that's the taking away, because they take the focus off of Jesus and so forth. They try to explain it, and that's the taking away of the continual. We go into a long discussion of continual and everything, but I have found nobody of the Seventh-day Adventists who explains how the Mass, which they date as beginning somewhere around 500 AD, that's 1,000 years after 457. The question that's asked, how long will it be, the taking away of the daily and the casting down of the sanctuary? And they use something that happened 1,000 years after what they call the beginning date. It's a sad disconnect, and if you can't follow what I'm saying, well, it's because you can't follow what they're saying. And like I say, they discuss in great detail, and they go into the original language and the history and all kinds of things, but when it comes to connecting the dots, they don't connect them. They have no proof whatsoever of beginning the 2300 years, as they put it, in 457. Their only supposed proof is connecting it to chapter 9. But all the proofs they give do not connect at all with Daniel 8 and 457. And even worse is the cleansing of heaven. Now, what does anybody know about what's going on in heaven right now? Much less at a specific date. You know, up in heaven in 1844, such and such. That's absurd. I'm not even going to go into their doctrine of cleansing of heaven, and it has to do with quite a bit of what their teaching is, of the cleansing of heaven, the beginning of a judgment, all kinds of things. And Jesus goes from one compartment to another compartment in heaven. They string together a whole bunch of scriptures unrelated to one another and come up with a whole thing so that their failed prophecy of 1844 can still be believed. That is, believed by those who don't see what's plain on your face, that it was a false prediction. It didn't come true. Forget it. He was a false prophet. The Word of God tells us to beware of false prophets and those who go about predicting specific dates of the coming of Jesus, whether it's camping of family radio, or whether it's the so-called Jehovah's Witnesses, or whether it's the Seventh-day Adventists, or whether it's this person or that person. Those who predict a specific date for the coming of Jesus are false prophets, and God warns us against them. Rather than taking a date and wrenching 2300 out of Daniel 8, it makes much more sense to see what the message really is. The message really is that there's enemies of God out there who are trying to stop God's way. But thank God there are those who are strong, who hold to the truth, and even give their lives to hang on to the truth. And another great lesson, of course, is that God had to protect the Jewish people. He had to protect the temple, because all of this period is in preparation for the coming of the Messiah. Daniel 8 is a tremendous chapter for us to be strengthened and encouraged by those who do not give in to secularization. It's a great chapter for us to see how God worked through the years to protect his people, his city, to bring Jesus into the world. Thank God for his work through the ages, as indicated in Daniel 8 and many other places in Scripture.